Hello, everybody. Welcome to another recording for History Valley podcast. Today, Dr. Bartosz Adamczewski joins us, and he's going to be discussing his commentary on Genesis. So, Dr. Adamczewski, welcome back to History Valley.
Welcome to everyone. I'm glad to be here.
All right, let's get started. Tell us about your commentary on Genesis. What do you think about the book of Genesis?
Sorry. Again, welcome to everyone. I think that the topic is really interesting because in the History Valley channel, we usually discuss things concerning the history of the New Testament, the Gospels, Paul the Apostle, and general New Testament stuff, Josephus, and so on. But I think that the Old Testament is also really very, very interesting, and it's worth discussing. I would say I'm a biblical scholar, not only a New Testament scholar, but also an Old Testament scholar. So I try to cover with my research the whole Bible. And what I discover is that the Bible is generally made in the same way in both the Old and the New Testament. I call it sequential hypertextuality, which means that the Bible, that the great biblical narratives are in fact reworkings of earlier writings. In the New Testament, the great narratives are generally reworkings of earlier works, like the letters of Paul the Apostle. In the Old Testament, the great narratives, like the book of Genesis, is a reworking of the book of Deuteronomy. So we cross the boundaries of literary genre here, but we obtain really marvelous and astonishing results. Just a short introduction. In scholarship, modern scholarship, the book of Genesis is usually regarded as a process merging at least two sources, which are usually called the priestly and non-priestly source or layers or material. But modern scholars generally regard the book of Genesis not as a coherent narrative, but rather as a set of quite different kinds of material. One of them is called priestly, and the other is called usually Yahwistic, or today scholars usually call it simply non-priestly. And the only discussion is which is later, which is earlier. Is the non-priestly material earlier or later than the priestly one? The other option is to regard the book of Genesis, in more conservative terms, as being written by Moses 1,200 years ago, and so on and so on. But this is in fact almost uncritical. So what I discover in my research is that the whole hypothesis of the sources or layers of the book of Genesis is in fact false. There is no priestly source and there is no Yahwistic source in the book of Genesis. The book of Genesis as a whole, from its beginning to its end, is a sequentially organized reworking of the book of Deuteronomy, from its beginning to its end. In this sense, the book of Genesis is internally coherent, as a coherent reworking of the book of Deuteronomy. If there are some inconsistencies in the book of Genesis, they are due to tensions which already exist in the book of Deuteronomy and its imperfect reworking, narrative reworking in the book of Genesis. So this is interesting because we usually tend to regard the book of Deuteronomy. The name itself says it is Deuteronomos, the second law. So it starts abruptly, and it seems that it is quite late, that it's later than the first law of Moses, which we find in the book of Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. But this impression is false. If we take the 5 books of the Pentateuch, then the book of Deuteronomy is the oldest one. It's the beginning of the Pentateuch. Later came the books of Joshua and Judges together as one literary work. It was the first working of Deuteronomy, a kind of sequel to Deuteronomy. And later came the book of Genesis, and then Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, as a kind of prequel to Deuteronomy. I think that, even if you are not well versed in the Old Testament scholarship, you probably know the Star Wars saga. If you remember the first Star Wars film, it was really amazing, astonishing to us all. And then came sequels. The story of the Star Wars, Luke Skywalker, and so on, R2D2, was prolonged to later episodes. But then the directors and producers invented another thing. Let's not continue the story along the line of time. Let's come backwards and make a prequel to the story. So first, normally, if you have a core of the story, then you write something which comes later, and only thereafter you write a previous beginning of the story, the so-called prequel to the story. And in this way, the sacred Israelite Pentateuch was made. Pentateuch means 7 books. First was the book of Deuteronomy, then came Joshua and Judges, and then later came the book of Genesis and Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, taken as one word. In this way, we have 7 books which go together, which form a kind of, say, unity. The oldest one among them is the book of Deuteronomy. And the book of Genesis is a kind of midrash. In Jewish tradition, it's called this type of reworking. It's usually called a Haggadic midrash, which means that it's a narrative storytelling which illustrates the laws that are contained in the earlier book of Deuteronomy. So the laws are illustrated by narratives. And the book of Genesis is a great illustration of the ideas, especially laws, but not only laws, also the stories which are contained in the book of Deuteronomy. What is important, that it goes sequentially. So even it's quite creative, as every midrash is. In modern scholarship, it's called hypertextuality. I try to avoid the term midrash here. I use the term hypertextuality. But what is important is that the sequence is preserved in details. So I discovered 1,000 elements which go one after another in the reworking of Deuteronomy in the book of Genesis. 1,000 elements which go one after another in the same relative sequence, one after another, from the first, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, to the last element of the book of Genesis, the death of the main hero in the exile. So we have the continuous reworking of Deuteronomy in Genesis, and also detail. If we have 1,000 elements, it means that we have one correspondence, approximately on average, one correspondence per 1.5 verse of Genesis and 1 verse of Deuteronomy. So it's really dense. At times, even words in phrases, not only sentences, but the order of words in sentences is important, because the author at times reworked just word after word in sequence in the Hebrew sentences. So alas, for those who do not know Hebrew here, you need to know Hebrew to understand this particular kind of reworking. It's not just images, ideas, themes, topics that are similar here or there. Here you really need to know Hebrew, as you need to know Greek to understand the Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles as a kind of reworking of earlier texts in the New Testament. Here you also need to know Hebrew, because you need to understand the order of words in Hebrew clauses and sentences, and how they were reworked by the author of Genesis in its own work. So I think that this idea is somehow clear, and I will later show how it's important for the understanding of the New Testament as well. So today I would like to discuss the Old Testament, the book of Genesis, but this is also important for the understanding of the New Testament. So let's start with the most obvious fact. The most obvious fact is that at least one element of Deuteronomy is almost verbatim, word for word, preserved in the book of Genesis. And this is one of the blessings. Probably all of you know that the penultimate section of both works are the blessings for the 12 tribes. In the book of Deuteronomy, these are the blessings for the 12 tribes of Israel. And in the book of Genesis, these are the blessings for the 12 sons of Israel, Jacob. So the blessings are reworked. And one of the blessings is repeated almost word for word from Deuteronomy to Genesis. And this is the blessing for Joseph, which shows us two things at once. The first is that Genesis is a reworking of Deuteronomy, as I already explained earlier. The second thing, which is also intriguing and has great consequences for our understanding of the whole Bible, is that if the blessing for Joseph is the most important one, not for Judah, but for Joseph, who is the patriarch of the northern Israel, we usually call it Samaria, Samaritans, and so on, but they themselves called themselves Israelites. That means that the book of Genesis and the whole Pentateuch from Genesis to Judges was written not in Jerusalem, not in Judea, but in Israel, in the tribe of Ephraim. And it has great consequences for our understanding of the Old Testament, and I would say also of the New Testament. That astonishingly, the Torah is not a Jewish word, it's an Israelite word. Jerusalem is absent in the Pentateuch. So the most important blessing, which is repeated in Genesis, is the blessing for Joseph. And it's repeated almost word after word. The blessing is contained simply in both works in the same form. So this is the final, or almost final level. But let's start from the beginning. At the beginning, in the book of Deuteronomy, there is the setting of the whole speech of Moses, and there's also the setting for the whole story in the creation stories, the first and the second one. The fact that there are two stories, creation stories in Genesis, does not mean that they come from two different sources, in contrast to what most modern scholars maintain. These are not two different sources. These are simply two stories, two creation stories, which are placed one after another, because they reflect two elements of the book of Deuteronomy. But then something that is very well known to every one of us, which is the account of the original sin. We are used to think that there is the account of the original sin of humankind in the book of Genesis. But there is also an account of the original sin in the book of Deuteronomy, in chapter 1 of Deuteronomy. But in Deuteronomy, the original sin is not the sin of humankind. It's the sin of Israel, the people who is called to faith. What does it consist in? In Deuteronomy, the original sin of Israel consists in the lack of trust in Yahweh. So this is the original sin of believing people, of people who are called to believe, to trust Yahweh. Yahweh says, the land is before you. I give you the land. Go and conquer the land. And they say, oh, we are not able. There are so many people there. The cities are walled up to heaven. And the people who live there are so great. We are not in a position to do it. Let's first send spies. Maybe the spies will bring us some fruit. And they bring, in fact, some fruit of the land, and so on and so on. And then they don't trust Yahweh. So this is the original sin in Deuteronomy. And I would say that this is the sin which is well rooted in the whole history of the Bible. If we do not trust Yahweh, this is our sin as believing people. The book of Genesis is a kind of catechetical book. catechetical in the sense that it tries to translate the very nationalistic and also religious terms of Deuteronomy into more broadly understandable terms which are understandable to everyone, I would say, in humankind. And that is why it can also be understood by little children. In fact, little children understand this. Instead of having the original sin of not trusting Yahweh, which is a very sophisticated, mystic, I would say, but sophisticated religious concept, the book of Genesis translates it into terms that are understandable even to little kids. There is something forbidden, a forbidden fruit, a forbidden tree with a forbidden fruit. Don't touch it. People touch it, eat it, and this is the sin, the original sin of humankind. So we have here one of the very interesting features of the book of Genesis, which is the universalization of the message of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy was directed to Israel. Genesis can be understood by everyone. Everyone can understand that there is something forbidden, and if you do it, you commit a sin, or you do something wrong, you may be punished, fined by the police, by someone, by the army, and so on and so on. Everyone can understand it. You do not need to be a member of the people of Israel. Everyone can understand such a thing. Likewise, the stories about a man and a woman, two brothers, a younger brother and an older brother, and so on and so on, a universal flood. These stories are understandable to everyone. So the author of Genesis took the ideas of Deuteronomy and illustrated them with the use of the stories which are understandable, I would say, to everyone in humankind. And this is beautiful in Genesis. I really like this book because it is so sophisticated that for thousands of years we have not been able to understand it fully. And on the other hand, it can be understood on the basic level by little kids. So it's really wonderful. A story that is, understandable to both sophisticated scholars trained in Hebrew and also little kids who are, 3 years old, and they understand that if they may not touch the apple, they don't touch the apple, and if they do it, they commit a sin. So the original sin, and also we have some linguistic connections here. In the book of Deuteronomy, it is said that you will not enter as a punishment. You are expelled. The people of Israel is expelled from the promised land. They die in the wilderness. And there is a promise that only two people, Caleb, son of Jephunneh, and Joshua, son of Nun, they will enter the promised land. And the little kids who do not discern between good and bad. And the Hebrew phrase, Yada Tovora, is repeated in the book of Genesis. The tree of the knowledge of good and bad. Good and bad. This is a better translation in English than good and evil. I consciously translated it in this way, good and bad. So the phrase knowing good and bad is taken from Deuteronomy, the first chapter of Deuteronomy, and it becomes a key term of the story of Genesis. So I think it's, really beautiful, wonderful to translate a sophisticated religious story concerning the original sin of Israel into a story of the sin of simply humans who do something contrary to this will. Then comes the story about two brothers. In Deuteronomy 2, chapter 2, there is a story about the Israelites who passed through the territory of their weaker brothers, Edomites. Edom is a country located south of Israel. And Yahweh tells them not to harm these weaker people. Yahweh says they are your brothers, but do not do any harm to them. In the book of Genesis, Cain represents Israel and Abel represents Edom, the weaker brother. And with the use of a story which is, again, understandable to everyone. Siblings rivalry. There are two brothers, the older one and the younger one. One is, more a mommy boy, and the other is more, a wise boy, and so on and so on. And the wise older brother beats the younger one. So this is understandable to everyone. And even such little details like the bloods of your blood cry out of the earth, they really reflect the territory of Edom. Edom means red. In fact, there were copper mines there. Copper is red and colors the soil into red. So even everyone who knew Edom a little bit, I've been there and I know this territory as well, knows that there are copper mines there and the ground is red. So someone who wrote the book of Genesis thought, yes, this is like blood. The color of soil is like blood. And the blood of the brother, the murdered brother, Abel, cries out of this soil, of this uh, land of Edom. So such things. And then comes the story about the flood. Why the flood? The flood is not in place in Israel. There are no floods there in the sense that is described in the book of Genesis. The floods are in Mesopotamia, of course, with the Tigris and Euphrates River. They can inundate a certain territory. So the story is obviously taken from Mesopotamia. It's out of place in Israel, but it's in place in modern Iraq, let's say in this world, in this way, sorry. And this story about the flood is taken to the book of Genesis. What for? To illustrate the Deuteronomic idea of the holy war, destructive war. In chapter 3 of Deuteronomy, there is the idea of conquering the territory of Transjordan. The flood was a perennial metaphor for a war. In fact, the soldiers inundate a certain territory like a flood. And we have this metaphor both in the Mesopotamian literature and also in biblical literature, for example, in Isaiah. So using the metaphor of flood to illustrate the idea of war, of conquering an enemy's territory, is old like humankind, like human literature. So the author of Genesis used this metaphor of flood to illustrate the idea of the war in Transjordan in Deuteronomy chapter 3. Moreover, because of the illustration of the ideas of Deuteronomy, he changed important Mesopotamian motifs. For example, if we take the flood story in the book of Gilgamesh, in the story of Gilgamesh, it's well known, it was discovered in Mesopotamia, so we can trace the differences. For example, in the story of Gilgamesh, the mountains appear all the time. The peaks of the mountains are not covered by war. In the book of Genesis stresses, highlights the fact that everything was covered, including the peaks of the mountains. Why? Because in Deuteronomy, it is said that no city was too high for us. The walls of no city were too high for us. So everything, even the highest walls, were covered by our army. They were conquered by our army. And that is why the author of Genesis introduced a change into the Gilgamesh story by saying that even the mountains, the peaks of the mountains, were covered by the flood. Moreover, the ark here is interesting. I wrote an article about it. Noah's Ark and the Ark of the Covenant. In the Gilgamesh story, there were several versions of it. In the Mesopotamian story, the saving vessel is a cube, 7-story cube. Whereas in Genesis, it's a prolonged chest. It's not a cube, it's a prolonged chest. Instead of having 7 stories, it only has 3 compartments divided by 2 decks. Why? Because the Ark of Noah, in fact, illustrates the Ark of the Covenant. If you imagine the Ark of the Covenant, a chest, a prolonged chest, and there were 2 tablets of the covenant placed one above the other, as you place shirts in a suitcase, for example, then the Ark of Noah is a kind of the Ark of the Covenant. it illustrates the idea of the Ark of the Covenant. Why? Because from Joshua, we know that the Holy War is preceded by the Ark. The Ark goes first. Who conquers the territory? Not so much the soldiers, rather the presence of the Ark of the Covenant. So, what is important in Genesis, and I would like to stress it, is highlight, because it is an important idea, is that humans, we as believers, do not touch the enemies. We are not called to punish Yahweh's enemies. And this is not only universalistic, it's only an ironic reworking of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is a book of war. The conquest, especially Joshua, is a book of war. The conquest of Canaan by violence, by force. The author of Genesis reworks these ideas in peaceful terms. We do not touch any enemy. We do not wage any war. We, as Noah represents us, we only close ourselves in a kind of get-to. In fact, we hide ourselves in the Ark of the Covenant, and we only watch what God does with his enemies, with the sinners of the earth. So we are not told to punish the sinners. We are not called to wage any war. And this is important in Genesis. A similar story later concerns Abraham. There is Sodom and Gomorrah, the sinful cities. And Abraham is not called to punish the sinners here. It is Yahweh's problem what to do with the sinful people in Sodom and Gomorrah. What does Abraham do? He prays for them. He behaves like a priest who prays for the sinners of this world. So Genesis, it's not only a kind of universalistic reworking of Deuteronomy. It's also an ironic, peaceful reworking of Deuteronomy. In fact, even Pharaoh in Genesis represents Yahweh at times, because he cares for the moral order in the society. Pharaoh, the Egyptian Pharaoh, who's a pagan, who does not know any commandments. He knows that he may not touch the wife of another man, although he is a Pharaoh. And the wife, Sarah, is the wife of an immigrant. But the Pharaoh knows that he may not violate the later commandment: do not cover the wife of anyone else and do not commit adultery. So he knows it somehow by intuition. So it's beautiful that in Genesis, even educated and wise pagans, they know how to carry out God's will, how to fulfill God's will, and how to, in fact, keep the commandments without knowing them. So the book of Genesis is universalistic, and it's also ironic, peaceful. In the book of Deuteronomy and later Joshua, the Israelites are called to conquer the land. Be courageous and conquer the land by force. Whereas in Genesis, Abraham, if he wants to have 2 square meters of soil, of ground, for burying his wife's son, he needs to buy this land. And he pays a very high price, 400 pieces of silver, for 2 square meters of a grave for his wife. So we are not called to conquer any territory in Genesis. If you want to have your land, you need to buy it. Not conquer it, buy it by money, with the use of money. So this is very, very interesting. And I think that it has great consequences for our modern situation as well. Because we usually look at the Old Testament as a testament of war, books of war, etc. And we already have in the Pentateuch a beautiful reworking of these war ideas, of the ideas of the Holy War, Cherem, the band, and so on, in very peaceful terms. I think that it is very important to us today in our modern world, in which we should transform our wars into, for example, economic rivalry, and peaceful, praying for the sinners instead of punishing them. Another thing which is also very interesting in Genesis, it's the famous Akedah, the Deuteronomy. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry for the interruption. Yes, for the interruption, there was some technical problems. one thing more, and then maybe you have some questions. The sacrifice of Isaac, the famous story, Genesis 22. In fact, it illustrates Deuteronomy 12, the legitimization of the holy place, the place in which the name of Yahweh should be put in. So in Deuteronomy 12, there is the chosen place which Yahweh chooses or will choose to put his name there, to make his name dwell there. And the author of Genesis reworks this idea of having one sanctuary of Yahweh, one central and only one unique sanctuary of Yahweh, by telling a story about the sacrifice of Isaac. And this sacrifice takes place at Mount Moria, or land of Moria, and then Mount Moria. This is a strange name because it occurs nowhere else earlier in the Bible. In fact, this is an artificial name. We know from Judges, for example, that there was the Mount of Moria, in fact, Mount Gerizim, the holy land of Israel, the holy place, sorry, holy mountain of Israel, Mount Gerizim, was also called Moria. In fact, the author of Genesis placed the name of Yahweh into the name of Moria. In this way, he obtained Moria plus the name of Yahweh, Yah, Moria, Yah, Moria. So the name of Moria does not point to Jerusalem. It is a linguistic, consciously made artifact, a linguistic creation to illustrate the idea, the Deuteronomic idea of placing the name of Yahweh in a certain place. So the place is Moria, the oaks of Moria, and the name of Yah is placed into the name of Moria. In this way, the name of Moria, Yah, is created. It is only later, in the much later books of Chronicles, that the books of Chronicles, which are southern Judean books, tell us that the Mount of Moria is located in Jerusalem. But it's a much later idea. In fact, Genesis has nothing to do with Jerusalem. What is told here, what is shown here, is that the place of worship of Yahweh, and the only place in which bloody sacrifices, slaughter animals, burnt offerings may be offered, is located precisely there, on Mount Gerizim, which is not Mount Zion in Jerusalem. Mount Gerizim is close to modern Nablus in the territory of Ephraim, in central Israel. So we have another confirmation of the fact that the book of Genesis is not a Judean book. It's an Israelite book, a northern book. And maybe another thing, and then we will stop for a while. Maybe it's obvious that the book of Genesis culminates with the story of Joseph. Again, Joseph is the patriarch of the northern Israel, of Ephraim and Manasseh, not Judah. Judah is a bad guy, is a bad character here. If you read the story of Judah in chapter 38 of Genesis, Judah is presented in most negative terms possible. He's a drunkard, he is a sinner, he loses his most important things like the ring, the signet, and everything, the stuff of the leader of the tribe, for casual sex with a prostitute, by the way, by the road, and so so he has no qualities to become the leader of a tribe, not to say the leader of the whole Israel. He is rude. He is powerful, but he is rude. He resembles the older brother of Jacob, Esau, in this way. He's powerful, but he's rude. On the other hand, Jacob and his son Joseph is the Ishtam, the perfect man. He's suitable for cult. And he is the main character, the main hero of the concluding part of Genesis, which again tells us that the story of Genesis is not Judean, it's not Jewish, it's Israelite. It was only later adapted by the Jews and later by us Christians. But originally, it's not Jewish, it's Israelite. It comes from the north. Joseph is the main hero here. Judah is very problematic. He is powerful, but wild. The only, I would say, positive reference to Jerusalem and Judah is contained in the story of Melchizedek. Melchizedek, the name Melchizedek says that he is Melech, which means a king, and Tzaddik, that he is righteous. So he is the righteous king. And he is also a priest, but he is not a priest of Yahweh. He does not know the name of Yahweh. He is the priest of God Most High, which is a pagan, kind of pagan monotheism, so to say. He knows that there is only one God, an absolute, like a philosopher, like Plato, for example. That there is one entity, somewhere, which is the Most High God. But he does not know the name of Yahweh. Knowing the name is the most important thing in the Bible. So he is a priest of God Most High, and he offers not bloody sacrifices, not slaughter animals. He offers bread and wine, so food offering, because he is not allowed to offer the bloody sacrifices, slaughtered animals, not to say burnt offerings. So the tribe of Judah and Jerusalem, because Shalem, he is Melech of Shalem, he is the king of Shalem, which alludes to the name of Jerusalem, can be accepted, provided that they are righteous, they are peacefully related to Abraham, who represents the northern Israel. Moreover, they do not make their own sanctuary in Jerusalem. They may offer only food sacrifices, bread and wine, and not offer any animals, because animals can only be offered at Mount Moria, the ram on Mount Moria with Isaac's story, and so on and so on. So Judah is somehow accepted in the book of Genesis, provided that Judah does not make its own sanctuary in Jerusalem. There's only one central sanctuary in Genesis, which is located, like in Deuteronomy, the same is located in the region of Shechem, central Israel. Jerusalem can be forgotten. There is damnatio memoriae, the damnation of memory of Jerusalem in the book of Genesis. The only story in which it comes in a positive way is the story of Melchizedek, which shows that they can be accepted as far as they do not make their own sanctuary. And the last thing, which is also important for the history valley, because we tell the story about text, but let's come to history and the date of this work. Abraham, as I argued in one of my articles, it's freely available. It's an open access. You may find it on Academia Edu, on my profile in Academia Edu. Abraham is Sanballat. Abraham and Sanballat. Sanballat was a governor of Samaria, Israel, in the Persian period, at the end of the 5th century BC, approximately 425 to 405 BC, approximately. So Sanballat founded the sanctuary on Mount Gerizim. And Abraham has important features of this Persian governor of Samaria. First, his origin is from Ur, and then he goes to Haran, which is strange because Haran is not on the way from Ur to Israel. This is a deviation. If you take a map, you will see that the city of Haran is located much north of the way from Ur to the land of Canaan. But these two cities, both Ur and Haran, were two important centers of the cult of the moon god Sin, moon god, Sin, in the Neo-Babylonian period. And the name of Sanballat means Sin Ubalid, make sin give life. So Sanballat is related to Haran. In the consonantal text, it's written in the same way as Haran of Abraham. He has a name related to the cult of the moon god Sin, and Abraham has similar features. He comes from the most important cities of the cult of the moon god Sin. Abraham is also related to Haran, like Sanballat is, and he founds the sanctuary on Mount Gerizim, Mount Moria. So Abraham has important features of the Persian governor of Samaria at the end of the 5th century BC. So Genesis was written not earlier, but later than Sanballat was active in Israel, in Samaria, at the end of the 5th century. If we take the possibility, I think that the story wants to tell us it, and that his son Isaac, and then Jacob, and then Joseph, we have three successors of Abraham. They probably represent the followers of Sanballat as governors of Israel, of Samaria, like Deliah and his son and his great son, which would suggest that the book of Genesis was written maybe 50, maybe 70 years later than Sanballat. So at the end of the Persian period. So we are able to date the book of Genesis up to, say, 10 years, approximately 340 BC. It's the end of the Persian period, before the beginning of the Hellenistic period. So I would say it's 2 generations after Sanballat, and I would say that we are able to date the book of Genesis quite exactly to 340 BC because of this correspondence between Abraham and Sanballat. So we touch real history here, with Abraham having the features of the Persian governor Sanballat. Moreover, as you already know from my talk here, we are still in the north, not in Jerusalem. Abraham is related via Lot to the Moabites and Ammonites in Transjordan, and via his first son Ishmael to Arabs in the south. And the same features, if you read the book of Nehemiah, concern Sanballat. He has an ally in Transjordan, Tobiah, and Geshem the Arab in the south. So he's not related to Jerusalem. He is related to Transjordan and to Arabia. And Abraham has his links to these territories as well. So I think it's really interesting that we can date the book of Genesis with such precision because of this correspondence between Abraham and Sanballat. So if the book of Deuteronomy can be dated to the end of the 5th century BC, or say 450 BC, but I would say around 500 BC, because it was written after the Battle of Pelusium. You probably know from history that there was a battle during which the Persians conquered Egypt, and it was this battle was held at the marshes of the Red Sea, as it's Yam Suf, as it's called in Deuteronomy, the Sea of Reeds, by the eastern say limit of the delta of the Nile River at Pelusium. So Deuteronomy, with its defeat of Pharaoh of Egypt, was always powerful, except for let's say one moment in history. Uh, the book of Deuteronomy reflects somehow this defeat of Pharaoh by the Persians at the battle during the battle at Pelusium. So Deuteronomy was written approximately, say, around 500 BC, and Genesis can be dated with much more precision to 340 BC because of the connection to Sanballat and his followers. And I think that Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph represent the sons of and grandsons of the Persian governor of Samaria. Maybe you have some questions here, because I talk much here, but maybe you have some questions here.
So you're suggesting that the sons of Shambhala were recast as the sons of Jacob.
Yes, as the sons and successors of Abraham. In fact, if Abraham has the features of Sanballat, then we know at least that he had two sons, but we know nothing about their successors. So probably, I would say that probably to the person who wrote the book of Genesis, these successors, these officials who took the office of being governors of the Persian province of Samaria, had some features of Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Or better to say, conversely, saying in a reverse way, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph have the features of the son, grandson, and the great grandson of Abraham. But we know nothing about them. We only know that, for example, Sanballat had a son named Deliah, but we know nothing about his features. Whereas we can say something about Sanballat. We know things, for example, from both coins, but also coins from Samaria, but also from the Elephantine papyri in Egypt, and also from the book of Nehemiah. So we have different sources which tell us important things about Sanballat, because he was probably the first Persian governor of the province of Samaria. So he was a very important figure. And that is why Abraham, precisely Abraham, has the features of Sanballat as the founder, say, of the new people coming from the exile. Abraham also comes from the exile from Ur and Haran. He comes from the land of Canaan, like Sanballat did from his Horon. It's called Sanballat the Horonite or Haranite. In the consonantal text, it's the same. It's only the vocals that make the difference, but the vocals come much later. So he has important features of Sanballat, and that is why I think that his son, great son, the great son, have the features of the successors of Sanballat, but we know nothing about them. So alas, we are left here. Maybe we will discover something more in the future, but for today, it is important to me that by recourse to them, we may date the book of Genesis with much precision to the very end of the Persian period, 340 BC.
So here's my final question. Do you think that there's any history in the Torah, anything in there that may go back to the time that we're supposed to believe that it happened, or do you think it's the whole thing is practically a reworking of events that happened in the first millennium BC?
Mm-hmm. So the whole Torah is a reworking of something else. As I said here, the whole Torah is a reworking of Deuteronomy. If we take the 7 books, because I take 7 books, not just 5, the Pentateuch, which is a later idea, the 7 books from Genesis to Judges, all of them started from Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is the oldest one, then came Joshua Judges as a sequel, the prolongation of the story, continuation of the story, and then later came Genesis and Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. But Deuteronomy itself is a reworking of Ezekiel, the prophet Ezekiel, who was the father of the Bible, who was the first one to realize the power of scripture, written text. And moreover, Ezekiel has the idea of the new covenant. And the new Jeremiah and Ezekiel, the 2 exilic prophets. And Deuteronomy is a kind of new covenant which is enacted in a narrative way in the book. It's the new covenant in the land of Moab, apart from the first covenant, which was made on Mount Horeb. So Deuteronomy itself is a reworking of the ideas of Ezekiel in the same way, made in a sequential way. From the beginning to the end, the blessing for the 12 tribes, in fact, reflect the artificial division of the land to the 12 tribes at the end of the book of Ezekiel. The idea of 12 is an artificial idea, because there are 12 lunar months in the solar year. So the idea that Israel consisted of 12, exactly 12 tribes, exactly 12, is an artificial idea. It's Ezekiel's idea, which is taken over in Deuteronomy. So what is historical here? I would say that every nation has some semi-legendary heroes at the beginning. Half legendary founders of the tribes, for example. We have this in Poland. In the United States, the story is a bit different, I would say. But for example, in Scotland, the myth of King Arthur, the legend of King Arthur. Was he a historical person, or is it a literary character only? Is it a literary fiction only? It's difficult to say, in fact. There are some legends surrounding such important figures, characters who were founders of tribes, nations, peoples, dynasties, and so on and so on. So we have some, for example, I would say that the name of Abraham comes from Isaiah. So probably Abraham, which is a rather strange name, may be somehow historical, the name of Abraham. The same with the name of Isaac, but it is written in a different way in the prophets than it is written in the book of Genesis. Then Jacob, probably the same. So these are the ancestors of the tribes like Ephraim, Manasseh, Joseph, and so on and so on. Maybe there were some historical persons at some time in history, but I would say that it's half legendary. The same refers to the Exodus from Egypt. Probably there was some group who came from Egypt to the land of Canaan, but telling the story that the whole nation, the whole people, 600,000 people emigrated from Egypt to Canaan is purely non-historical. So I would say maybe there was some historical core at the end. But for example, the name of Moses, as I argue, is an artificial name. It represents the name of Ezekiel. Ezekiel is called son of man, so son of someone, son of a man. And Moses in Egyptian means the same. Tutmoses is a son of Tot. Ra-Meses is a son of Ra. But Moses itself is son of someone. So Moses linguistically reflects the term son of man, the term applied to Ezekiel in the book of Ezekiel. So the name of Moses, in fact, is probably artificial. But the names of Abraham may be somehow traditional. So maybe there is some historical core in the Torah, in the Pentateuch, like the names of the ancestors of the tribes. Maybe a kind of a group going out of Egypt at some time. But basically, it's illustration of some legal and theological ideas, which was written quite late. And I would say that the scope of the Bible is not to register history. The scope of the aim of writing the Bible is to create the past in order to shape the present. So the books of the Bible were written not to record history, but rather to create history in order to shape the present. So it's a different aim of writing them. They are not historical in our modern sense of history. Their scope was different. It was similar to Iliad and Odyssey, for example, or Aeneid in Rome. The foundation stories which tell us who we are, who we should be, and not who we were 1,000 years ago.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.